Welcome. We are really, really excited to have really a conversation with all of you, in addition to with each other, that focuses on imagining the future of our sector. And what we have planned for you from a format perspective is we're going to share some initial thoughts from each of our panelists or guests up here. And then we're going to take some questions that you all submitted as a part of the bookstore. And then we're going to take your live questions, and we'll have folks in the audience with microphones. So we want this to be very much a conversation. We want to engage with you. We want to engage with each other. We want to call each other on things that we might not agree with. We want you to do the same, really focusing on what do we think the future of our sector is going to look like. So with that, I just want to kick things off and invite each of you to share from your perspective what you think the biggest game changers are going to be for the nonprofit sector. And if you can think about sort of short term, so maybe the next 2 years, and then longer term, looking 30 years forward. Jacob, do you mind starting?
I'd be happy to. I'm thrilled to be here at the Board Source Leadership Forum. So let's start with 2 years. Let's imagine a nonprofit sector 2 years from now and think back to what Art Taylor talked about at the luncheon plenary and our collective battle against the overhead myth, our collective desire to be judged on more than just accounting ratios. And I believe that 2 years from now, we're going to actually begin to see signs of a transformation in terms of how donors, journalists, our colleagues in the nonprofit sector, researchers, foundations, and others make judgments about nonprofits. And I think this is going to happen for a number of reasons, but it comes down to one fundamental concept, which is having a multidimensional common profile about nonprofits. Donors are looking for something familiar that tells the story of a nonprofit organization. They have fallen back onto the oversimplification of the overhead ratio. But I believe that collectively, we can replace that with something that is still familiar, is common, but that is truly multidimensional, that is not just financial data, not just operational data, but also programmatic data, also opinions from stakeholders. So 2 years from now, I expect to see continued shifts in donor behavior. I expect to see that common profile established throughout the nonprofit sector. That may sound like a short time horizon, but remember how quickly things move in technology. And this is, in many ways, a question of technology playing out across the nonprofit community. How many of you know what an API is? Anyone? All right, there's a handful. So an API is an application programming interface. That's the way one database talks to another database. That's how on so many websites you see a Google map. That's because that website is talking to Google. The concept of an API, I think, is a fundamentally transformative concept for the nonprofit sector because it means that information moves fluidly from one place to the next. And we're going to see over the next 2 years APIs shifting and flowing information around the nonprofit sector in new and transformative ways. Mark my words. But 30 years into the future, I think we could imagine an even greater transformation. That's far enough ahead that I don't have to hold myself accountable because no one will remember what I said 30 years ago. They might remember what I said 2 years before. But when my father and I used to walk our dog, we would go down to the local elementary school, and there would be giant flocks of chimney swifts, these little black birds that would swoop around, and we would watch the flocks. And the flocks would combine and break apart and recombine in this beautiful dance. And my hope is that 30 years from now, the nonprofit sector could be like those flocks of birds. And that our ability to come together in collaboration, to break apart into individual initiatives, to recombine as appropriate, could become transformed 3 decades from now. And some of that is M&A. It's about mergers and acquisitions. And I believe that 30 years from now, we're going to see a whole lot more of that. But it's not just M&A, it's also E&E, entrance and exit. You know, in Silicon Valley, where I used to live, if your organization, your company got acquired, people threw a party and congratulated you. In the nonprofit sector, if your organization gets acquired, people say, well, what went wrong? That is a profound tragedy because acquisition is a sign that you built something valuable and it's being pulled into another entity to take that to scale. That's something we should celebrate. And I believe that 30 years from now, we can be like those flocks of birds and come together, break apart, come back together according to what really matters, which is what the people and the communities and the ecosystems that we all serve need. That's going to require a new way of thinking about governance that is less organization-centric and more issue-centric. And it's going to require both ambition and humility. Ambition to think about what could we truly do together if we acted like those flocks of birds, as well as humility and a willingness to let go of that sense of organizational identity as the dominant unit of analysis. The unit of analysis shouldn't be the organization. It should be the broader community, the broader ecosystem, the broader flock of nonprofits.
Thank you. Richard, how would you answer that same question?
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me to be here and to share some ideas. A few years ago, my firm did a governance study for the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, and I had the opportunity to interview the chairman of the board, who coincidentally invented Microsoft Word and Excel. And it was probably the most interesting interview I've had in my entire career. And when I asked him a normal kind of governance question, if 3 board meetings a year that they had was the right number, he paused and said, well, 4 is probably too many and 2 isn't enough. And 3 is probably right. So I began to think, I began to drop this. I began to think that that was a good way to approach questions. And so when I think about things, for example, how many cookies I want, when I know that 6 isn't enough and 8 is too many, I can have 7. When I thought about how many trends or predictions I would like to make today, I thought that 5 was too many and 3 wasn't enough, so you're going to hear 4. A few of them are based on anecdotes, and everybody says that a lot of anecdotes don't make a fact, and so these are not facts, but anecdotes are really quite good for predictions. Number 1, the sector will continue to experience surprise financial crises at organizations of all shapes and sizes, and people will continue to chatter about whether it's the board's fault, whether it's the staff's fault, or whether it's everybody's fault. I think that that will be true in 2 years, and I think that'll be true in 30 years. No one likes to hear about New York, but that's where I'm from, so you have to bear with me for a moment. We've had a confluence of disasters in the nonprofit world over the past 2 years, some of which you may have read about. The New York City Opera blew a $50 million endowment and closed down 2 years ago. Another very well-known opera company closed last year. 2 major social service agencies declared bankruptcy, one after the board came to a board meeting and found out there was a $20 million deficit. They closed down. And one when it was discovered that the CEO stole several million dollars, he went to jail. A third major cultural social service organization you might have heard about discovered that the CEO, in collusion with the CFO's nephew, stole several million dollars, and tragically, that CEO committed suicide. Coincidentally, each of these boards was filled with successful lawyers, Wall Street people, and businessmen. In a year from now, we will have more examples to be surprised about. Board Source cannot possibly keep up with the need for improved governance practices in a sector that's growing so rapidly. Second, incidents like the above will increase talk of standards for nonprofit board members. People have talked about mandatory board training before somebody can join a board. People have talked about training while people are on boards, the way that doctors and lawyers and accountants have to go back for their CLE credit. People are always talking about best practices, but it's doubtful in my mind whether this will ever happen in the near term or in the long term. Despite the protestations of many people about excess regulation, there's a long-standing practice of loose regulation of charities. There is no Securities and Exchange Commission, relatively little coverage in the press about the sector. You'd have to think hard to find what newspapers actually have somebody with a nonprofit, a full-time nonprofit beat. And the IRS essentially approves any application for nonprofit status that arrives at its office with a stamp. A few state attorneys general are interested, but it's not a major activity. And despite the great work of GuideStar, Jacob, I don't believe they have regulatory power, which I'm sure some days he might like. Third, in terms of trends, money from large donors will continue to pour into the sector. It is happening right now and should continue into the future as more and more money seems to be arriving in society and more billionaires are filling the list every year. People will continue to put their names on buildings at every university, hospital, and cultural institution in the country. Um, in New York, not only are they putting names on or institutions that don't have names, somebody actually paid the Fisher family $15 million to remove its name from Avery Fisher Hall, so they could then ask David Geffen to give $100 million. It is now David Geffen Hall. So things change that quickly. In additionally, the power of money will result in large sums being poured into 501c3s and 501c4s to influence public opinion on major issues. We've seen it already. Gun control, climate change, charter schools, the death penalty, and other things, where money, a lot of the research that has been done over the last several years by organizations working in these fields has been funded by philanthropic organizations. I believe this will continue because I don't really believe there's going to be much regulation coming out of Washington to stop it. And finally, the impact of early retirement will be felt throughout the sector. We're currently successful professionals end their careers and look around for something to do. Many of them say, well, maybe I'll look at the world of nonprofits. This has already begun in New York, certainly, and around the country, I believe, when lawyers and accountants who take early retirement because their firms have policies wake up one morning and say, I really don't want to play golf all the time. Also, there are people who've been on boards for a long time and retire who are also looking for some more to do. So what happens? I've observed private sector people discovering the sector and joining boards for both good and bad reasons. And often when they join, they're looking for ways to fill up their calendar. They ask for more committees, they ask for more meetings, they ask for more involvement, some of which is good and some which is bad. But I've heard more than a few CEOs complain about board members, new board members in particular, overstepping their roles into matters of management. This is true not only for new board members, but for board members who've been around for a while, but all of a sudden have more time to be a board member. Another implication of early retirement is people in their 60s with little or no nonprofit experience becoming CEOs of foundations and nonprofits. Boards often look to people they know when a CEO position is vacant, and they know people in the private sector. Further, search firms justify their fees by saying they can find people the organization couldn't find by itself. So since the organizations are in the nonprofit sector, they often immediately go to the private sector to look for candidates for jobs and for people who fit the bill. I think we will see more people from outside the sector entering it later in their careers. Now, on the one hand, there's been a management deficit people talk about, and I think that this could solve that problem. On the other hand, it may limit possibilities for advancement for people in the sector. John Kenneth Galbraith, the Harvard professor and former ambassador to India, once said, if you're going to make predictions, make a lot of them. We didn't have time for a lot of them, but I hope the ones I offered will provoke some discussion.
Thank you. Glenn.
Thank you. So let me first say how excited I am to be here and be on this panel with such a great group of people. Originally I think it was going to be Rachel with Catch a Fire on the panel, and I had the great strategy to send her a text message and let her know that the conference location moved. And when she asked where it moved to, I told her Russia. So she's really far away, and I'm here, and she's there. So this really worked out. So I'm really excited, and I love these questions about future, because at the Center for Nonprofit Advancement, and in the spirit of full transparency, as we heard during the lunch plenary, we actually have a crystal ball. This is true. We actually have a crystal ball in our organization, and in that crystal ball are nearly 1,000 nonprofit organizations and their board members. There's hundreds of consultants. There are foundation representatives and others who we look to find out and forecast what is going to happen in the future. We forecast that by reading the tea leaves and also measuring the outcomes for what has happened in the past. So through that lens, I thought that I would touch on just 3 areas here today from a direct service nonprofit standpoint in which we can see and think about what will happen 2 years from now and ultimately 3 years from now, 30 years from now. And the first area is education and capacity building. We launched a study recently of our members, as we often do, to get that crystal ball knowledge, to hear from them in which areas they believe they are most deficient and what they believe the needs are. Well, through that study, we uncovered that the large majority of organizations indicate they would like more resources that they can invest in capacity building, specifically human resources, which is a lot different than normal. Not just human resources, but they're wanting to realize how they can be better at engaging employees and retaining employees. I know we've had a lot of conversation about millennials, but 30 years from now, the millennials will be the ones making the decisions and the hiring decisions, right? So who will they bring on board and what will that organization look like? How will we engage individuals and keep them focused over long periods of time? We realize that a lot of organizations intend to do a better job meeting people where they are to maximize productivity, whether they are meeting them in the field or in the air. They can work from wherever they'd like to be as productive as possible, and creating good incentives for them to stay, in fact, with that organization. So education and capacity building is one key area. The other thing we realize is that more and more employees are taking professional development so seriously that they are paying for it out of their own pockets when the budgets in their organizations don't afford for it. So the thought is that professional development is really important to be the best they can be in their individual positions, and I can see that growing and also paying dividends into the future as well. Another area is evaluation. I think we've come a very long way. We've come from anecdotes to data. There was a time where just simply suggesting that things are going well was good enough, and now data is required in order to demonstrate and measure that things are going well. Well, now we're moving into a future where evaluation is happening real time. It's happening both on the performance level, but also the organization level by way of social media and other web-based means. So we're being evaluated on not just who we are, but how we are as an organization. I think we will be shocked 30 years from now to see what that evaluation process looks like. We have offered quite a few competitive award programs to compete organizations together on key and core skill sets to understand what new innovation they're bringing to the table from time to time. And I see Marshall Ginn here, who hosted a great session on our Management Excellence Award. He's the chair of that selection committee. And every year we get more best practices that amaze us. In the early parts of that process, which would probably be 30 years ago, just having a strategic plan was exciting. Today, you have to do a lot more in order to be innovative, and let's see where we are, in fact, 30 years from now. The other thing that I'll touch on just in closing is that we are only as good as the operational team we have supporting us. I've been really delighted to work with the team at BoardSource, Vernetta and Andy Davis, and helping us to lead our Board Leadership Award. But investing in the infrastructure of our organization has always paid dividends. I think the change will be the way we make those investments, finding out what means the most to people, providing that to them to ensure that they are able to stay with us, grow beyond us, and ultimately be the leaders of tomorrow. So thank you for that question.
Great, thank you. So I'll add just a couple of things from my perspective, and they've both been touched on, but to sort of underscore them a bit more. I think that both in the short term, looking 2 years out and looking 30 years ahead, we are, I think, we should be anticipating major changes from a people perspective. There were lots of predictions several years back about folks transitioning out of roles that ended up, I think, being delayed, thanks, and lots of others have commented on that as well, but, delayed due to the financial crisis, but I think we're starting to see the beginning of that, and I think that's going to be really interesting from a board perspective and just an overall organizational perspective to see what that means in terms of who's stepping into those roles, and if there are some significant generational differences in terms of who's stepping into those roles, what that's going to mean from a board perspective in terms of the need to understand and think across generations between boards and CEOs. And I think that we're going to see that. It started to happen, but I think we're going to see a lot more of that in the next couple of years. Longer term, as you made the point, Glenn, I think you're absolutely right. When we think about, we talked a lot about millennials over lunch, but when you think about having millennials as the sort of elder statesmen in the boardrooms, what is that boardroom going to look like? Is it even going to be a boardroom? And sort of thinking about what that will mean from a governance perspective and an organizational perspective, and how we as organizations can start to anticipate that now rather than waiting 30 years to figure it out. I also think, Jacob, you're absolutely right in terms of mergers and acquisitions, or really just the thinking around what does it mean to be a nonprofit organization or a mission-driven organization, and thinking cause or issue or mission first, structure and even sector second. And I think 30 years from now, things are going to look radically different in terms of the way that folks are thinking about why and how they're structured the way that they are. So we're going to start with some questions that you all submitted, and then we'll take open questions live. So Glenn, actually, can you
Sure.
reach in and pick out a first question? And we'll just all give our thoughts.
Voila.
Great. So the question is, do you think that co-leadership of nonprofits will be common? Thoughts?
I mean, I would just start by saying I think it already is common. You might have different titles. In the context of a executive director and a board chair, there's already co-leadership. But in terms of co-leadership where you have the same title, I would not be surprised if we saw more of it. It tends to make me nervous, I'll admit, in those cases I've seen. When you have an extraordinary amount of trust and great communication, it's possible to do well, but that's not a trend that I would necessarily look forward to.
Say more about that. Why does it make you nervous?
Because I think leadership does require clarity of roles. It also requires immense humility and a sense that power and responsibility run up and down the chain, not just in one direction. But you do sometimes need one person to make decisions, whether they're governance decisions or strategy decisions or just purely operational decisions. Now, again, at its best, a great organization can figure out how to navigate that with a sense of true equality in terms of title and role. But it's hard to do.
Mm-hmm. I don't know that I wouldn't go so far to say that I disagree with you, but I don't have the same nervousness about that, and I think it is absolutely going to happen in terms of more and more frequency. And I think, obviously I think about the impact on boards and what that's going to mean for boards, because as I'm sure many have talked about in sessions throughout the conference and in other conversations, the mantra of the board having one employee, the CEO, that is radically different. And what that's going to mean in terms of the partnership between boards and co-leaders, and what we can learn from the early adopters of this model, I think is going to be really important for us to figure out, and important for BoardSource to help provide some leadership around, because I do think that's going to start happening a lot more, and sometimes formally. And I think we're also going to see a lot more of it informally, with just kind of less of the superhero CEO doing it, kind of themselves type of leadership style, which I think tracks with some of the generational changes as well.
I would just add that over the last many years, I've seen it tried and fail more often than it succeeds. I think it really does depend on chemistry. And often two people will work out an arrangement to report to the board, but one kind of emerges as the one who actually is a decision maker. And often one leaves unhappily. So it has worked in a few places, but I really think it's less successful than, it's often less successful than one hopes at the beginning of an arrangement like that.
If I could just add, I put a lot of stock in the board. From a governance standpoint, first job being to hire and evaluate the CEO. I think if the board is functioning well, it can work. We were fortunate to have an organization to win our board leadership competition this year that has co-executive directors. If I had to assess them just by the way they operate, I'd say there's an introvert and an extrovert. The accountability lines are clear and the reporting lines are clear, and they're super successful. But getting governance and our boards operating at the highest level, I think, can really make any model work, but that's what we don't see as often as we'd like.
Richard, do you want to pick a question?
Oh, sure.
Feel free to read it.
What do you envision will be the next big thing we can expect from BoardSource 2016?
Well, I'll tell you, and I didn't pay Jacob to talk about mergers and acquisitions, but one of the things that we are thinking a lot about is how at the board level boards can more proactively think about structure changes, not just mergers, but structure changes that would allow them to do their work better or bigger or with greater impact. One of the things that we will be tackling in 2016 is thinking about, from a board culture perspective, what does that look like? How does the board have those conversations? How does the board create kind of an ongoing focus on opportunities for partnership and collaboration that might enable them to do their work differently? So I don't know if that qualifies as a big thing, but that's a big thing that we're thinking about and planning to focus on. What do you think we should? I guess since you guys didn't get to respond to that question so much. Anything else you think that BoardSource should be tackling in 2016?
I mean, I know it's something you're already thinking about, but giving boards tools to have more sophisticated conversations around overhead with their staff and with donors, and an ability to confront the hard conversations about why organizations often need to make these investments, and for that to go all the way up to the board level. And I just think BoardSource could play a very powerful role in facilitating.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because another thing that we've been thinking a lot about and talking about together is sort of helping boards and organizations as a whole understand the fundraising piece of overhead, and thinking about how to equip boards to understand their fundraising operation well enough to know if they are comfortable or uncomfortable with the way that they are deploying resources for fundraising. Because obviously there's a lot of attention paid to fundraising costs and fundraising strategies. There have been huge articles that really kind of call organizations onto the carpet, more increasing sort of legislative or regulatory action around that, and so helping boards make some sense of that, and really have some tools to think through: are we comfortable? Are we uncomfortable? If so, why?
I would also say, and this is an opportunity. I look at it as an opportunity rather than a criticism. I had a phone call, two phone calls, one yesterday, one this morning, with clients. One, the head of the board chair of a big nonprofit, and one, a trustee of a foundation. They both said to me, "Where are you?" And I told them New Orleans. They said, "What for?" And I told them the BoardSource conference, and they said, "What's that?" And I said to them, they are the, Standard and Poor's, whatever you want to call them. They're they have monopoly on board governance. Anybody that wants a book about, how you should run a nonprofit board, any issue, we send them to BoardSource. That's, and they said, "Oh, I'd like to learn more about that." So there's a big, there's 1,800,000 nonprofits.
Depending on how you count, but yeah.
So, anyway, there's a big market out there, and if there's any foundations in the audience, you should, I think, give Ann a lot of money to expand her operation.
Thank you. Great. Should we take another? Did you have any thoughts, Glenn?
I'll just say really quickly, I think it would be awesome if BoardSource could align even deeper with philanthropy to ensure that having a board that is laser focused on building its own capacity is almost a prerequisite to getting funding, right? So that's a question. When was the last time? I got one fan back there. What are you doing? How much of it are you doing? I think board members are ashamed to say what they don't know, and it's what they don't know that hurts us most in the boardroom and hurts our productivity as nonprofit organizations. So.
I'll just add a comment there, something that Jacob and I worked on together, that BoardSource and GuideStar did together, was around some core or key governance practices that we thought were most important, and met the criteria of being able to be a yes/no question, and added them, or GuideStar added them to their profile. And that's a really powerful tool for organizations to use as a way to highlight the fact that you're really thinking about governance and board leadership with great intentionality. It's also a real opportunity for funders to look at that information and ask nonprofits that they are funding or considering funding why they haven't responded if they haven't, or why they responded the way that they did if they aren't doing those things. So that's an opportunity, I think, for those in the room to think about a little bit of an advantage for you in terms of being able to share that publicly with your potential donors and funders. Just out of curiosity, how many folks have seen that and responded or shared information about your board practices via that platform? All right, well, you have a to-do. Great. Let's pull another question.
Will we have more or fewer than 1.5 million organizations in 20 years? I will start by saying it depends on how you define an organization. Will we have more than 1.5 million organized groups of people working for social good? Yes, absolutely. Will we have more than 1.5 million 501c(x) organizations? I don't know. And I think if we're really smart about moving to this flock of nonprofits world where organizations are combining and breaking apart as appropriate, maybe we'll have fewer. But I don't know. That's hard to say. What do you guys think?
If I had to predict, I'd say we'll have more. I mean, I think the barriers to entry don't exist, and young people in particular are, I'm always surprised to see some new nonprofit with a name I never heard of started by a 25-year-old. And I think it's great. And I think, as long as they can figure out a way to deliver a service that people need and raise money and everything. So I actually think that if I had to predict, I would say that there'll be more.
Yeah, I'd predict more also because there's no shortage of great ideas by, I'll call them bullheaded people who don't want to collaborate or partner. They want to start their own thing. So there would be more. Whether or not they'd be financially active and productive with good outcomes is questionable.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think it will be more, but I'm not sure that's a good thing.
Right.
And I'll just take a moment here to make 2 points. One, I will just say, as a Gen Xer, I feel very lonely in these generational conversations. Because it's either baby boomers or millennials. And there's actually several million of us in between. Admittedly, it is a smaller generation, but...
not as lonely as me, I don't think.
But the second point is my generation. I'm 38. Whether that you think of millennials and Gen Xers, we can bundle them together even. I do think that the understanding of what leadership is has gotten too tied up with entrepreneurship in the sense of starting something new. And that's something that we in our generation have to recognize, that leadership can take many different forms, including taking over an organization that already existed and trying to reinvigorate it. And that actually requires different skills. It requires different kinds of support from other generations. But it may prove to be, when thinking about questions like scale, a far more important set of skills. So I hope, don't forget the Gen Xers, and B, talking to myself and to millennials, I hope we all can really think about the many different ways that leadership plays out, not just in starting something new.
That's great.
Right.
I'll pull one. Okay, so the question is, what must we do differently as a sector to really move the needle? Thoughts?
To move the needle?
To move the needle.
It's a great question.
Well, I don't know. It depends on what people think moving the needle is. If you're talking about having a real impact on society, which is what I would think we would all be wanting to do, I think that we've got to have more, and you touched on this, I think we have to have more emphasis and more focus on really evaluating outcomes and what organizations are doing and what they're really accomplishing. Somebody once said the nonprofit sector is the only sector in America where you can deliver a service for which there is no demand. And in a certain sense, if you can raise enough money, you can have an organization. And there's a lot of organizations around in our communities that do exactly that. They kind of go along for a long time. There's no reason to go out of business. That's providing a service for the people that work there and the board, and they do some good things. But I don't think there's enough attention paid to really whether the donors and whether the people that are the investors in these organizations are getting a good return for their money. And I think it's very hard if an organization, very hard if a donor wants to figure out where to actually invest in child welfare or drug addiction or any of the causes that a lot of us think are important. It's very hard to point them to organizations and say, they really have a great record in terms of outcomes, and they can prove it if you talk to them. There's just not enough information around.
Yeah, I would connect that to the collaboration conversation as well, and actually to your previous point, Jacob, about the importance of the profile of leader and leadership that can come into an organization and really think about how do we do this differently, and the opportunity to really use evidence-based decision making to identify those things that are working, and then figuring out how to apply that across multiple organizations, or work within an ecosystem so that multiple organizations are able to benefit from that learning. I think we do that some, but I don't think we do that enough. And if we did, I think that would really move the needle.
I'd say doing a lot better of a job telling the story, sharing and shaping who we are as a sector, so that more households get it and understand it. I still get the question from students as to whether or not I get paid at my job, and to what the sector is. So from a communication standpoint, if we could do more about what we are and less about what we're not, I think that would really help move the needle, help more of the next generation to move into the sector and see it as a viable career path, and also bring resources and other support so that we can grow and have greater outcomes.
That's great. That's great. Let's take your questions. Where are there questions in the audience? And I see one here. Do we have a mic coming?
Hey, how are y'all? Thank you so much. In terms of continuing this dialogue about moving the needle, it just immediately made me think of, and I'm sure a lot of you have seen the Dan Pallotta TED Talk, right? The infamous Pallotta TED Talk. And he talks about the fact that when it comes to market share, we haven't been able to move the needle for, I think he says, 50 years, right? Because we can't market. Either we don't market, we can't market, it's taboo to market. If we do something glossy or sensational that competes with the for-profits that can spend oodles of bucks in marketing, then we're considered, that's where the articles come in. That's when the papers start writing all about the bad stuff we're doing with money. So how do we tell the story without being able to invest significantly in marketing if we're not fortunate enough to have somebody who happens to be a marketing expert who donates all this stuff to us? And even if that happens, even if we beg, borrow, or steal for it, and it's great stuff, it still comes back and looks bad on the organization because it's too good in terms of what we're putting out there. So how do we balance that moving forward? And then where do you think, what's our market share going to be in 20 years as not-for-profits? Just your guess. 2% to what? What's it going to be in 20 years?
So I'll offer a couple thoughts here. So when you look at philanthropic giving as a percent of GDP, it has stayed in a very narrow band between about 1.7 and 2.1% over the last 30, 40 years. So in a way, you could say we're stuck. You could also argue that we're doing incredibly well because A, that's 1/3 of $1 trillion every year just in the US, and B, it is a far, far higher percentage of GDP than any other country by quite a bit. I believe we can go higher if we can build new kinds of trust about the nonprofit sector. But that's not the only way to measure our collective role in society, because nonprofits bring in money through a lot of other sources, through government contracts and earned income, which bring us up to, depending on how you count, about 6% of GDP. And that's something that I think we could continue to see rise as nonprofits simply provide better services that people are willing to pay for, but ultimately driven by a social mission. So that's how, in my mind, it plays out collectively. And also, if we can get leverage, not just providing the services, but doing the advocacy and the research that change how the corporate world and government act to ultimately lead to better outcomes for the people and the communities and the ecosystems we serve, that's great. Heck, I mean, if that involved the nonprofit sector shrinking because we were getting better at influencing those two bigger parts of society, that works for me too. But for an individual organization, you run into this problem. Like, how do you invest in marketing to actually be able to achieve the scale that you think you need to achieve your mission? And one thing you said is, without having someone donate the marketing skills, this may be a place where we have to pay for it in terms of staff, being willing to offer a salary that's going to bring on some really talented marketers. I will say, I hope that we think of marketing beyond just raising money, that marketing is also about telling a story for a broader community, influencing government and corporate players, influencing behavior, et cetera. But that is a place where we may just have to choose to invest and ultimately balance. And the idea of the Overhead Myth campaign is not that spending money on administration and fundraising is inherently great. It's not. It's that if it allows us to ultimately create greater results, to bring in those new resources or invest in our infrastructure, then it's worth it. But we have to keep our eye on the ball on those end results so that growth doesn't become an end in and of itself.
Yeah, and I would just add, I think that you're right in terms of the challenges, and that's one of the reasons that BoardSource has been doing a lot of thinking about how we can help, because to your point, you need to be able to invest in those things, and it's not serving our missions best if we have to do everything in the cheapest way possible all the time, even if that means that we do less. And so I think that there's some work that we need to do inside the sector to sort of own that, and to be able to explain, as GuideStar and your partners in the Overhead Myth campaign have done so well on overhead broadly, what this is really about, and how fundraising and raising money is fueling the work of the sector rather than something that is separate or tangential to the way that we operate. Other thoughts?
Well, I would just say that I think it really depends on what the organization is and what its brand is and who it's trying to appeal to. So if, a huge percentage, sometimes a third or maybe 40% sometimes, depending upon the study you look at, of the money that comes in the sector is in the form of fees. And that includes hospital reimbursements, that includes tuitions at universities and colleges all over the country, that includes ticket sales at cultural institutions. So if you're trying to appeal to people, if you're trying to say, here, send your kid to college here, you want to have a certain image of prosperity and of a certain high level. Whereas I think if you're a small community organization that's serving foster kids and you're really working hand to mouth, you don't want to have a slick brochure so somebody can accuse you of something. So I really think it has to fit whatever your market is and whatever the image is you're trying to project.
Yeah, and for me, I think whenever there's been a shortage of dollars, collaboration has been really helpful to get things done, and coordination in that regard. We really push ourselves as a sector that collaborates more than we actually do. I think we're still in our silos, and we don't adapt things that work well. Some of our organizations do a really good job reaching people as young as middle school who get the message about the sector home to their parents and on and on. Other organizations create their own way. So I think the more that we can adapt great practices from a marketing standpoint when they are working, the more we can collaborate and coordinate with each other, the stronger we'd be as one sector to get those messages out.
Other questions? One in the middle here.
Hi, I think it was Richard who mentioned that in the future he sees a lot more chief executives coming from the for-profit world into the nonprofit world. Well, having worked for two that have done this, and one that was highly innovative and brought the organization to phenomenal new performance levels, and the other who almost ran the organization into the ground, I guess the first part of the question, are there any existing resources that you would recommend to boards in better recruiting for the right skill set in the for-profit world for a nonprofit chief exec? and potentially any tools that you can foresee to help boards and senior staff in the transition of a for-profit to a nonprofit. My perspective, being in DC, you have a lot of career nonprofit workers who have great disrespect for for-profit chief execs who come in and think, oh, they don't know what the hell they're doing. I'll leave it to you.
I'll offer two resources on this. One is the Bridgespan Group has some great resources for people in the private sector who are trying to make a transition to the nonprofit sector. I think those could be applied to boards. Second is the writing of Jim Collins, a famous business writer who has a short little 40-page monograph called Good to Great in the Nonprofit Sectors. And on the very first page, he talks about how nonprofits should not be more like businesses. All organizations should be more disciplined. And so I think just those are two I would mention. But all of this comes back to basic human moral behavior and the difference between humility and arrogance, and a willingness to accept that people coming from other sectors may have great, profound insight. But those people coming into a new community have to do so with humility and an open heart. And we all have to kind of reach back to kindergarten and remember how to be human beings, I think.
I'm so glad you said that, because I think humility is a huge part of this in both directions. So to your question about search and what to look for, I think that is, from a character perspective, a really important lens. Not just for for-profit folks coming in, but in general. Yeah.
See one in the back?
Yeah, question in the back.
Thanks. Thank you for another excellent conference. I came last year, and this has been just as good, I think. My name's Tim Plumtree. I'm from Canada. We kind of look across the border at the United States with a certain detached perspective, a kind of a mixture of admiration and sometimes puzzlement. I won't say when which prevails. I don't have a question. I have two comments I'd like to share with you. The first relates to streams and eddies. There are streams of thinking in the field of governance and the field of management, sort of mainstream, and then there are eddies that flow around the side. And there's something going on in those two fields that I think Jacob gets from his perspective, and that I've seen evidence of elsewhere when one reads about the millennials. And that is that there is a new way of thinking about how people work together. I sometimes call it working sideways rather than working vertically, thinking sideways rather than thinking vertically. And I think there's something really interesting going on in the field of both management and governance that challenges us to think about whether we need to abandon the old paradigms and start thinking about new ones. Now, it may be that what I'm talking about, it's the chimney swifts thing that you alluded to, Jacob, and there are other examples of that. And I don't know whether we're talking here about an eddy, a little backwater that's just kind of off on the side, or whether actually we're talking about something that's absolutely going to be mainstream, and not in 30 years, because in 30 years the millennials will all be in their 60s, or many of them will be. I think it's more like 4, 5, 6 years off. I don't know. I think that's a challenge for BoardSource to think about. So that's one comment. My second comment has to do with legitimacy, not a word I've heard very much. But for me, I think there's a question of legitimacy for boards of directors. We just elected a new prime minister in Canada, and his handlers sent out an email after he was elected inviting Canadians to submit their names if they wanted to get a job in the new, of some kind. And there were 5 different things that they were looking for, and one of the five categories was stakeholder engagement. And what I sense, at least under his leadership in Canada, is more and more interest in stakeholder engagement and outreach to citizens to seek their views in decision making. What I've not heard a lot of in respect of boards of directors are two dimensions of that. One is the question of their legitimacy, the degree of their attachment to the members that they're supposed to represent. We all know how many board elections occur and how little relationship there may be between those people who are elected as directors or selected and the people who they supposedly represent. I think there's some interesting questions there. as we move forward. The other is the question of the degree to which boards need to be concerned about the relationship of their organization to their stakeholders, and what boards need to do in order to make sure that they resonate to the interests of those stakeholders. So 2 thoughts for you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Any reactions?
Right on.
Yeah. I would just, on the point of stakeholder engagement or stakeholder feedback, there's some really interesting things, some work being done right now. I believe it's the Fund for Shared Insight that's funding it, around an evaluative system that has been adapted from a for-profit model that is being used by many nonprofits, called the Net Promoter System. I mention it because I think it's a very easy to implement, or relatively easy to implement, system that allows for ongoing feedback that can very easily be shared. I mean, it's obviously implemented by staff, but very easily shared as a part of a dashboard for boards that can be kind of quick pulse, ongoing measures of how are we doing and what are our users or clients or members, whoever your audience is, telling us about the value of our offerings. I really like it, and I'm drawn to that system because of the ability to do it on an ongoing basis. And I think that, kind of the small e evaluation rather than the big E evaluation is a powerful resource for us as a sector, to be able to do it on an ongoing basis instead of just doing some big expensive study every 2 or 3 years.
One other thing I'll mention in the concept of legitimacy is something that was mentioned at the lunchtime plenary, which is the concept of a platform. That now so much of our commerce and our conversation and our culture is mediated through platforms that are in the private sector, but also the nonprofit sector. Whether, Google and Facebook are obvious examples, but think about Wikipedia, which is a nonprofit. It's mediating a lot of important conversations. That was a role that used to only really be played by government. And I would argue that GuideStar is aspiring to play a role as a platform for information in the nonprofit sector. And that raises the bar for legitimacy in really important ways. Because if you are the one who's coming in between someone and information, or someone in a certain decision, then you have a profound responsibility to handle that in an appropriate way, in an open way. And I think many other nonprofits are going to find themselves being one kind or another of platform within their community, and it makes this question of legitimacy all the more important.
So we have time for one more question. There we go. Great.
I'd like to get you to hark back to the comments that you made before about the overhead issue and the marketing and branding of the sector, and to a comment that was made at lunch about referring to ourselves as community benefit organizations as opposed to nonprofits, because we keep talking about the for-profit sector versus the nonprofit sector. But there are for-profit companies that are nonprofits. We're the not-for-profit sector. Our focus is not on making profit. It's on doing good in the communities. How is this, and it's a semantic question, but it has underlying substance. And I'd be curious to hear how you look at how we position all the organizations that are in this room going forward, really as not-for-profit, and how we present ourselves in the context of the overhead question and the branding question that you've raised before.
Great question. I'll kick us off, but then obviously jump in. I think that you're absolutely right that thinking or that mentality around nonprofit is part of the dynamic in terms of overhead and fundraising or marketing expenses. And there is an opportunity for us as a sector to talk about the outcomes, the impact of our work in a way that makes it much more clear and powerful why it costs money for us to do what we do. And I think that is kind of the first step to really breaking that down. If there is clear value and understanding of the impact that we are achieving, then it becomes, I think, much easier to make a compelling case about why you don't want to under-resource those efforts.
I'll just underscore that and say there's a huge opportunity there from a sector standpoint. It's troubling that we have so many different ways that we refer to ourselves: nonprofit, not-for-profit, NGO. Can we come up with one more way to confuse the public as to what we really do and how we focus our energy? It is an opportunity from a marketing standpoint. It would definitely get the attention of the country, and many people would want to know exactly what's happening. So, great point, great question.
Okay.
Other thoughts? Great. Well, sure.
Mm-hmm. Heard that.
I don't know if everybody could hear, but the comment made was that some folks have talked about the nonprofit sector being the for-purpose sector, and has that caught on? Have folks heard that? So sounds like it hasn't totally caught on, but maybe
It's coming.
but maybe folks
train
think
is
it
coming.
should. Thank you, thank you. Well, I just want to take a moment to thank all of our panelists. Thank you so much for sharing your insights
very
with
much.
us. And thanks to all of you for an incredible 2 days. We are so happy that you spent these past 2 days with us. We hope you had a wonderful time. I want to thank again our host and planning committee members who helped make this conference great, particularly those based here in New Orleans who helped us think through a lot of the programming, including yesterday's session, concurrent plenary. Thank you. I want to thank all of our speakers and session presenters, the Board Source Board. I want to thank the Board Source staff, as you might imagine. Takes a lot of work to put on something like this. And then I want to share with you that, as I mentioned yesterday, we are shifting to a biennial schedule. So our next conference will be in October 2017, when we will be in Seattle. We hope you join us. Thank you.